start the record. Sorry about the slow start up here. And then I will share with the folks who are zooming in these slides. Okay. All right, folks, thanks for coming today. Sorry about the late start. I'm having technical difficulties with the microphone in here. But it doesn't look like they'll be able to repair it before class starts. So we're going to go ahead and begin anyway. Let me minimize this. Okay. So in the first class, we just talked about some of the introductory material about the semester. And then I spent, I think, maybe 20 or 30 minutes kind of starting to discuss the Federal Reserve System. And we got a little bit into this discussion of the Federal Reserve District Banks. And that's where I want to pick up today. So by the way, I think, am I just imagining things, or did I let you guys out at 6 o'clock on last Wednesday? And this class ends at 6:15, right? I always do that. The first day of the semester, when I teach a 5 o'clock class, I always forget. For some reason, when I look at the clock, I think 6 o'clock is the time when class ends. That's not going to be the case. It will normally end at 6:15. So I apologize about that. I'll let you go early if we finish the material, but usually that isn't the case. I'm usually kind of rushing to finish it all. Okay, so this is where we left off last time. So we talked about the basic structure of the Federal Reserve District Banks. And I think we finished on the last slide, which we discussed kind of who owns the district banks. That is the member banks in each of these Federal Reserve districts that essentially purchase stock in their Federal Reserve District Bank. And then we talked a little bit about the board of directors as the governing body for each one of them. I want to dig a little bit deeper today into a talk about what the specific responsibilities of each of the three main components of the Federal Reserve System are. So we've got the district banks. We're going to get into a discussion of the Board of Governors, headquartered in Washington, D.C., and we'll talk a little bit about the Federal Open Market Committee. In the next class, we'll begin talking about the money supply process and how the Federal Reserve can impact the supply of money in the economy. Okay. All right, so the 12 Federal Reserve District Banks carry out a number of really important duties in our economy that are related to a couple of different things. One is what's called a payments system, and they also have some greater responsibilities regarding their role as a central banker, in particular with the control of the money supply, and also some important things regarding financial regulation, which I'll touch on briefly, okay? Let me start by talking about the payment system. And I may have talked about this just very briefly in the last class. But what exactly is a payments system to begin with? That is essentially kind of this web of arrangements in our economy that we use in order to purchase everyday items. Right? So it's the institutions or the arrangements in our economy that allow us to conduct transactions every single day, all right? Now, you guys already know what some of the main features of the payment system are. Coins, okay? Fiat money. What is fiat money? That's those green dollar bills that we all use from time to time to purchase stuff. Paper checks are also part of the payment system. More and more these days, however, people are utilizing electronic payments, so debit cards, credit cards, different types of electronic funds transfer mechanisms. One of the most important is this thing over here, ACH. That stands for Automated Clearinghouse Transactions. How many of you guys get a paycheck every once in a while where your pay stub is deducted automatically into your checking account? Right? That system works through the Automated Clearinghouse system. If you have direct payment of bills that get withdrawn from your checking account every single month, that happens through these automated clearinghouse networks. The Federal Reserve District banks are in charge of maintaining the integrity and the efficiency of that payment system. That allows individuals to actually access the goods and services that they're trying to consume. One of the, excuse me, one of the most important aspects of the payment system, or the Fed's role in the payment system, is their role in managing the nation's check clearing process, as well as operating these large wire transfers. Now, you guys have probably heard of this before, but in a lot of times, customers at banks need to wire huge sums of money from one bank to the next, all right? The system that oversees all of that is this thing called FedWire. That is the automated wire transfer system that kind of links together thousands of different banks in financial institutions. This wire system is actually being phased out over the next few years and is going to be replaced with a new one called FedNow. You don't really need to know this for this class, but really the only key differences between those is that the FedNow system is going to connect a larger number of different financial actors together, and it's supposed to be a 24/7 real-time payment. So I believe FedWire is only operational during regular banking hours, but FedNow is going to be a 24/7 real-time payment system that allows banks to make these wire transfers instantaneously. The Federal Reserve District banks are in charge of maintaining the health and efficiency of all of those things. They also manage the currency in circulation. How do they do that? The Federal Reserve District banks are the entities in our economy that issue new Federal Reserve notes, as well as coins, and they withdraw damaged notes and coins from circulation. Now, just to be clear about this, it is not true that the Fed is literally the organization that prints the dollars, okay? The U.S. Mint, of course, mints the coins that we use in transactions. And this group called the Bureau of Engraving and Printing is the one that actually prints these green dollar bills that we all use. The Federal Reserve District banks, where they're involved in this process, is they coordinate the distribution of new coins and new dollars out into the economy. And they're responsible for removing the damaged ones from circulation. How many of you guys are aware of the coin shortage that's going on in the U.S. economy right now? So it's all over the news, right? Stores are not really giving exact change in a lot of instances because there's this huge nationwide coin shortage. Well, the Federal Reserve District banks don't mint the coins, the U.S. Mint does, but they do distribute newly minted coins to banks in each of these districts. Do you guys know why we have this coin shortage? Where are all the coins? Where have they gone? Who has them? You guys do. Well, maybe not you literally, but regular people that use coins on a normal basis, like at the laundromat, or if they go to a casino or something like this, or just use it for small transactions. Because during the pandemic, people are staying inside and not going out and shopping as much, regular folks are actually accumulating more and more of these coins. And so stores and retail places have experienced this huge coin shortage right now. I want to talk just for a minute here about the Fed's role in the nation's check clearing process. This is an important issue that I think is key for students in this undergraduate class to understand, because there's a common misconception about how paper checks are actually cleared in the U.S. economy, okay? If you ask just a normal person who writes a check for some item, most people would probably think that once you write your check and you hand that check to a merchant in exchange for goods and services, that merchant deposits that particular check in his or her bank, and then your bank, or my bank in this case, will transfer cash over to the merchant's bank. a highly inefficient process where money kind of moves around from one bank to the next. In the olden days, that's the way it was done, okay? But now that the Federal Reserve district banks are in charge of this check clearing process, that's not actually the way it takes place. It's much more efficiently done. I've got this little flow chart here to illustrate exactly what I'm talking about. And it takes you through the steps of how a check is actually cleared in our economy, okay? So let's go through the steps one at a time so you guys kind of understand how this works. Now, I know most of you probably don't use paper checks to purchase goods and services with, but they're still used quite a bit in this economy. And the Federal Reserve district banks play a key role in those checks clearing. So this is kind of how it works. Imagine, what's your name here in front row? Jameson. Let's say Jameson goes to a furniture store and purchases a new couch for $1,000, and he writes a check for that couch, okay? Jameson is going to hand that check from his bank directly to the merchant in exchange for the couch, okay? What is the next step in this process? The merchant is then going to deposit Jameson's check in his or her bank account, right? Or more likely what's going to happen is the merchant has a little device where they can scan the check and they deposit just an electronic image of that check directly into their bank account, okay? At that moment then, the merchant's account is credited by its bank, right? So the furniture store gets an automatic credit in its checking account. All right, now what's the next step here? It does not involve cash being shipped from Jameson's bank to the merchant's bank. What happens is the merchant's bank will then send that electronic image directly to its Federal Reserve district bank, all right? So the furniture store here, Jameson, then sends that electronic check to the district bank in Atlanta, all right? Now, what is the Federal Reserve's role in this process? What they instantly do is the Fed will credit the merchant's bank's reserve account and debit Jameson's bank's reserve account. That's a little bit of a mouthful. Remember, what is the Fed? It is a bank for banks, right? All of these commercial banks, Jameson's bank, the merchant's bank, they all have essentially checking accounts called reserve accounts with the Federal Reserve. So when that electronic image of the check hits the Federal Reserve's desk, they credit the merchant's bank's reserve account and they debit Jameson's bank's reserve account. What's the next step? The Federal Reserve then returns that electronic image of the check to the customer's bank account, Jameson in this case, and that bank immediately debits Jameson's checking account and therefore recredits its own account. So the Federal Reserve District Bank here is playing actually a critical role in moving electronic funds from Jameson's bank directly to the merchant's bank. There's actually no cash that is transferred from one bank to the next, despite the fact that a check was written. It's done much more efficiently than that, right? The Federal Reserve basically changes numbers on its electronic ledger so that Jameson's bank is debited and the merchant's bank is credited. Those moves then get filtered down to the retail level, okay? And so all this stuff happens pretty quickly, and the Federal Reserve District Bank is in charge of maintaining the efficiency of that system. They charge a small fee to all the banks in the Federal Reserve System to participate in this kind of check clearing process. That's one of the ways the Fed actually makes money. So be mindful of that the check clearing process is much more efficient than most people think, and it's operated by the Federal Reserve district banks. Okay, the district banks also perform a number of crucial responsibilities that have to do with its role in actual central banking. So let me talk about some of those for a few minutes. I think the most obvious one, and probably the most important, is that The district banks, since they are the arm of the Federal Reserve that comes into contact with the public, they are the ones that are actually conducting this discount window lending to private banks. So when your local bank is in need of additional liquidity and it needs to take out a loan, oftentimes what it'll do is it will go to the discount window at the Federal Reserve Bank of, let's say, Atlanta, right? That's the mechanism by which the Federal Reserve lends money directly to commercial banks. It does that through this thing called the discount window. It's not the Board of Governors that does this. It's not the Federal Open Market Committee, but rather the individual 12 district banks across the country. The district banks also perform a number of supervisory and regulatory functions. For instance, they audit the member banks locally. They evaluate these merger applications. A lot of times banks are trying to merge with one another. Anytime that takes place, the Federal Reserve System has to evaluate those applications. Banks have to meet a lot of capital requirements that I'm sure you guys have heard of in the news in the last few years. Banks undergo these things called stress tests from time to time. All of that regulatory activity is formed by each of these district Federal Reserve banks. That's one of the things that they do differently than the other components of the Federal Reserve system. One of the more underappreciated roles of the district banks, in my view, is that they collect and publish data on the nation's money supply and flows of credit. This enables professional economists to actually conduct research in the area of macroeconomics. So the Fed district banks, they through surveys and other collection methods, gather all of this data on the money supply and different flows of credit and interest rates, and they make all of that data publicly available. The Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis maintains a wonderful database of a ton of different macroeconomic data that you guys are going to use in your lab assignments throughout the semester. Another important thing they do is that each of these district banks actually employs probably dozens of PhD macroeconomists. These folks conduct research and they publish articles on different monetary and banking topics. But one of the great things about these articles is that they're written in a way that is made accessible to the broader public. All right, so for most academic economists, we have to try to write articles that are going to go in scholarly journals. Okay, the language, the stuff that appears in those articles is at a very technical level, and it's only accessible to a very narrow audience that has also been trained at a PhD level. Okay, the papers that are being published in the Federal Reserve publications, however, are written in a way that's much more accessible to a broader audience. In fact, I think I've put at least a few articles written by these central bankers on your reading list for the semester. So an undergraduate with some knowledge of econ should be able to digest this stuff pretty well. The last, I would say, important responsibility of the Federal Reserve District Banks is that the president of each district bank will from time to time serve as a voting member on the Federal Open Market Committee. We'll talk more about the FOMC a little bit later today. But just so you know, right now, the FOMC is the chief monetary policy body for our country. When the Fed is determining how it's going to set interest rates and control the money supply, it's the FOMC that is making those key decisions. Well, the district bank presidents play an integral part on that committee, and will vote on that committee on a rotating basis. More about that in a few minutes. Okay, you guys have any questions then about the district banks? So again, part of the first 2 days of this semester is just to kind of learn or familiarize yourself with all of the background information about the Federal Reserve System. There's these three large components. What is it that they do that's different from one another? So you can expect on your first exam, and probably on your first lab, some questions regarding what the specific roles of the different branches of the Federal Reserve System are. So what is it that the district banks do differently than the Board of Governors versus the FOMC? Right? What is the structure? What does the composition of all that stuff look like? So this first set of slides provides all the details you need to understand that. Okay. Let me move on now to a discussion of the Board of Governors. So the second major component then of the Federal Reserve System is this group called the Board of Governors. The Board of Governors is headquartered in Washington, D.C., and they really have ultimate authority over the whole Federal Reserve System. The Board of Governors, in theory, I should say, consists of 7 members, 7 governors, who are appointed by the President of the United States, but also have to be confirmed by the Senate. Okay? Now, it is true, one thing you need to know here is that these board members, these governors, are supposed to be appointed to 14-year non-renewable terms in office. Moreover, each of those 7 terms are set to expire on a staggered basis once every 2 years, every other January 31st to be exact, right? So all 7 board members are appointed by the president and nominated by the Senate, and they're supposed to serve these really long, non-renewable terms in office, all right? Now let me stop there for just a second and ask you guys why that is. Why do you think this provision was written into the Federal Reserve legislation? What's the reasoning? What's the logic behind why it might be a good idea for members of the Board of Governors to serve these long, non-renewable terms in office? What's the rationale behind that, you think? Yes? Well, that might be a bad thing. I mean, hopefully monetary policy can take actions that will affect the economy pretty quickly. Any other guesses? Yeah. First row?
The Federal Reserve seems to local specific to long term to help them avoid that political pressure.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's probably a better answer. Is the idea here is kind of the same idea as to why we appoint Supreme Court justices to lifetime tenure, right? We don't want our Supreme Court justices to be unduly influenced by the people who appointed them, right? We don't want them to be influenced by the political process too much. That is beholden to the executive branch or bend to the persuasion of people in Congress, right? It's the same basic idea. When it comes to the economy, we have these long-term macroeconomic goals, getting back to your point, right? So it's probably a better idea to have our governors serve these long terms of office so that they're not too heavily influenced by the current administration. It gives them a layer of independence, right? The fact that these terms in office are set to expire once every couple of years, in theory, what does that accomplish? It ensures that any single president should not be able to completely pack the full composition of the Board of Governors, right? That even a president that lasts for 2 terms for 8 years shouldn't have too much ability to completely put all 7 members of whoever he wants on the Board of Governors, right? Now, I say all of this in theory, because in practice, things are very different. In practice, what has turned out in recent decades is that people who've been appointed to serve on the Board of Governors, because they can make so much money in the private sector, in other jobs, they oftentimes resign before their 14-year term expires. And that gives the President of the United States the ability to appoint new people into the position. This chart, this table down here shows the current makeup of the Board of Governors, okay? So you need to know that the current chair of the Board of Governors is Jerome Powell. Most of you probably already know that. Rich Clara is the vice chair. Randall Quarles is the vice chair for supervision. And we currently have 2 other members of the Board of Governors, Lael Brainerd and Michelle Bowman. This shows when their term began and when it expired, okay? Now you'll notice here that we don't currently have 7 board members. Well, we haven't. It's been very difficult for the United States Senate to really do its job and confirm 7 governors to the board in the past, really 3 or 4 election cycles. And so right now, Judy Shelton and Christopher Waller have been nominated by the president, but they are still their appointments are still under confirmation in the Senate. They have not been confirmed yet, and I honestly couldn't tell you when or if they will be confirmed. But for right now, we actually only have 5 active governors on the board, but in theory, we can have up to 7. The President of the United States gets to pick among the 7 governors who is the chairperson of the Board of Governors. Okay, and so right now that's Jerome Powell. Right? His term. So when you're the chairperson of the Board of Governors, you serve as the chair for a 4-year period, but you can be reappointed. Okay, so for instance, Ben Bernanke was the chairperson of the Board of Governors for 2 consecutive 4-year terms. Janet Yellen, after him, was the chairperson for only 1 term. President Trump indicated that he was not going to reappoint Janet Yellen to an additional term as the chairperson, and so she actually resigned from the Board of Governors, at which point Trump appointed Jerome Powell to be the chair. Okay, you guys have any questions then about the composition of the Board of Governors? I think the main points here is that in theory there are 7 of them. They're appointed by the president, have to be confirmed by the Senate, and they have these long staggered terms in office. And the justification behind that is we want to try to insulate the Board of Governors. The Federal Reserve legislation was written in a way where the BOG would be insulated from outside political pressure as much as possible. And so getting them these long terms in office achieves similar outcomes like we would see for Supreme Court justices, right? That they can simply focus on monetary policy and financial regulation and not worry about having to answer to members of Congress or the president too much. James,
does it work like if someone resigns early, they get it? The person that replaces them serves the remainder?
That's a good question. Yes. So what happens is, for instance, Alan Greenspan served a time on the board that was longer than 14 years because when he came on, he finished someone else's term and then served a full 14 years after that. So yes, you technically can serve more than 14 years if you're completing a previous appointment up until expiration. But again, Jameson, the modern view of the Fed now, at least among the governors, is that they tend not to hang around for 14 years. That's a long time, especially when all of these guys and gals could probably be making $1 million a year in the private sector, right? The salaries of the Fed governors is pretty low, believe it or not, compared to what they could get elsewhere. I say low, it's a few $100,000 a year, but that's a lot less than a few $1 million a year. Okay, the duties and the responsibilities of the Board of Governors are actually quite different than the district banks. But I want you to know, at least in the modern Fed, the powers are sharply divided, but the board is now the dominant force. The district banks play a crucial role in our economy, but the Board of Governors is definitely the dominant force within the system. Let me just review quickly here what the main policy responsibilities of the Board of Governors are compared to these district banks. The first thing you need to know is since 1935, actually, the Board of Governors has been responsible for setting these things called reserve requirements. You guys know what that is? What are reserve requirements?
Just like the minimum required balance of like cash.
Yes, so when you make cash deposits into your checking account, banks, well, I should say up until a few months ago, were required to hold a certain fraction of those deposits in reserves. For many years, it was about 10% over the first few million in deposits. So effectively, reserve requirements were 10%. Banks would keep 10% and loan out the 90% to investors. For reasons that we'll get into later in the semester, and these are all important, we live in a world today where banks are awash in reserves, that banks themselves have elected to hold billions and billions of dollars worth of reserves, what are called excess reserves. It used to be the case that banks didn't want to hold any excess reserves because there was a cost associated with it. But now banks hold billions of dollars in excess reserves. And so finally, just a few months ago, actually, so this happened since the last time I taught this class, the Fed announced essentially the end of reserve requirements. So yeah, we still have reserve requirements, Jameson, but technically now there's zero. But the Fed could come back later and say we're going to increase those to 5% of deposits or 10%. But right now it's actually zero. And that's because reserve requirements are basically irrelevant at the moment because essentially every bank in the banking system is holding huge amounts of excess reserves. The other thing that the Board of Governors does is that although they're not involved with the issuing of discount loans, that's what the district banks do, the Board of Governors actually coordinate the interest rate that the district banks charge on those loans. We don't want to live in a world where the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta is charging an interest rate on discount loans that is different than the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston or San Francisco. We want all of those interest rates to be coordinated, to be the same. The Board of Governors coordinates those. So the BOG sets the discount interest rate, but the district banks control the actual volume of loans made. So make sure you know that distinction there. What else? The Board of Governors also has the major role in establishing guidelines for open market operations and other basic monetary policy decisions. So we'll talk about this in a minute, but the Federal Open Market Committee, that's this chief monetary policy-making body, 7 of the voting members on that committee are the 7 governors. And so those governors have an outsized influence on the decisions that the FOMC makes about monetary policy and these things called open market operations, which we'll talk more about later in the semester. So the BOG, the Board of Governors, has a critical role in the nation's conduct of monetary policy. One other thing that they do, the Board of Governors is responsible for setting the interest rate paid on banks' excess reserves. Now, this gets back to a point I made about reserve requirements. The main reason why banks used to never want to hold excess reserves is because banks didn't get any interest on their holdings of reserves. That's no longer true. Banks now get an interest payment directly from the Fed on their holdings of excess reserves. It's a rather small interest rate, but it's a positive rate nonetheless. And so this encourages banks to accumulate reserves. The Board of Governors is in charge of setting what that interest rate is. that banks, it would be like if you got an interest rate on your checking account from your bank. And some of you may do that. But the Board of Governors is responsible for setting the interest rate that commercial banks get on their reserve accounts with the Fed. Let me just briefly mention some of the other responsibilities of the Board of Governors. So one of the things that's probably most visible, you might see, is that the board, in particular, the chairperson of the Board of Governors, is responsible for advising the president on economic issues. And they also testify to Congress at least twice a year, right? You'll see that all over the news and on C-SPAN and CNBC. The Board of Governors is also responsible for setting margin requirements and performing other types of regulatory duties. What are margin requirements? What do I mean by that? Anybody know what that is? That is the regulation on the fraction of a security price that an investor must pay for with cash as opposed to credit. Okay? To prevent too much speculative behavior on the part of investors, the Fed doesn't want investors to simply be able to borrow an infinite amount of money to make investments. And so they require that investors actually use their own cash to purchase at least a fraction of these securities. Those are margin requirements. I think there's something like 50% in the US. It's the Board of Governors that sets what those requirements are. There are other regulatory functions that the specific activities that are permissible for banks to do, the Board of Governors can determine. They approve mergers of federally chartered banks. One of the other ones that they do is that the chairperson of the Board of Governors serves on this Financial Stability Oversight Committee. I don't have that in the slides, but this is another committee that was created in the aftermath of the financial crisis to try to maintain the stability of the financial sector. So these are some other regulatory responsibilities of the Board of Governors. The last one that I'll briefly mention, the BOG exercises administrative controls over the district banks. So each of these 12 district banks, the salaries of their officers, their budgets in particular, are controlled administratively by the Board of Governors. Okay, you guys have any questions about that so far? All that pretty straightforward? Let me mention a few other things about the board. When it comes to discussions about the Board of Governors, oftentimes what happens is that we end up talking about the chairperson of the board, whether it's Alan Greenspan or Ben Bernanke or Janet Yellen. The Board of Governors oftentimes kind of takes on the personality or the persona of the chairperson, because obviously that person is the most publicly visible, okay? But how do you think we should judge? By what standard should we use to measure the success or the failure of a chairperson of the Board of Governors? Historically, the way we've judged them is by looking at how the Fed has performed along its number one policy priority during that chairperson's tenure, and that is the behavior of inflation, right? Now, later in the semester, we're going to talk about the different policy goals of the Fed. But undoubtedly, in the long run, the most important one is for the Fed to try to maintain price stability. And they interpret that usually in terms of low and stable inflation, okay? So here is the first graph I'm going to show you this semester. This is a time series plot of a particular measure of inflation that the Fed often pays attention to. And that is the annual rate of change in the deflator for personal consumption expenditures. So this is basically an average price index for the types of goods that consumers buy: clothing, electronics, etc. Okay. Now the actual inflation rate that I'm showing you here is one that it's been treated in a particular way. It actually excludes food and energy items. Now, there's a good reason why the Fed sometimes ignores food and energy items. Turns out that things like gasoline and breakfast cereal, those prices are pretty volatile. They move around quickly over time. The Fed is really interested in trying to understand longer run trends in inflation, and some of that high frequency noise that is in food and energy items will tend to obscure these underlying inflation trends. And so the Fed will oftentimes ignore these kinds of volatile food and energy prices when looking at a core measure of inflation. That's what this variable is. It's the annual rate of change over time, okay? So you can see, for instance, during the 60s and 70s, inflation was increasing and getting much more volatile in the United States. It reached highs of about 10% in the late 70s, early 80s. Throughout the 80s and 90s and 2000s, inflation in the United States came down to much more stable levels, around 2%. These vertical black lines here demarcate when we had a change in the chairperson of the Federal Reserve. So here was William Martin from, I think, the late 50s all the way up to about 1970. Now, just given how inflation behaved, would you say that Martin was a successful or an unsuccessful Fed chair? He came in with inflation at about 2%, and he left with inflation at about, 4.5%. So by that measure, he kind of allowed inflation to get a little bit too high, right? But it turns out, actually, that Martin is probably one of the most popular Fed chairs ever, because for a different reason. Before his tenure, the Fed didn't have much independence from the Treasury. The U.S. Treasury Department determined what they wanted interest rates on Treasury bills and bonds to be, and the Fed hit those particular interest rates in the market. But once Martin became the Fed chair, there was something called a Fed Treasury Accord that allowed the Fed to have greater independence from the Treasury. Even though inflation went up, he's regarded as a successful chair for that reason. What about Arthur Burns? Would you say he was a successful or a poor Fed chair, simply by looking at the performance of inflation? Doesn't look so good to me, right? Inflation was around 4.5% when he came into office. It was very volatile in the middle of his tenure, and then he exited with inflation at about 6.5%. So inflation was trending up and was becoming extremely volatile. William Miller was the Fed chair for just about a year and a half, and inflation continued to go up. So most don't regard his tenure as being very successful either. The first kind of modern central bank chair that seemed to be able to rein in inflation in this country was a guy named Paul Volcker. Okay, he came in at the very end of 1979 and exited in 1988, and was able to wring inflation out of the economy. It was about 10% early on in his regime, and it was around 3% when he left. Now, make no mistake, in order for Volcker to bring inflation down that much, he had to basically engineer a very severe recession during the 1981 to 1983 period. Unemployment was high, economic growth was low or negative during that period. But all of that reduction in demand was able to lower the rate of growth of prices pretty substantially from like 9 or 10% all the way down to around 3%. So it was a painful adjustment, but he was able to get inflation out of the economy. Alan Greenspan is widely regarded as one of the greatest central bankers, I guess, of all time. When he came into office, inflation was around 3 to 4%, and over his long tenure, he got it down to kind of a stable 2% inflation. Ben Bernanke was the chair between 2004 and 2012, I believe. And again, inflation fluctuated around 2%. But most people regard Bernanke as a really successful Fed chair, primarily because of what he was able to do, how he was able to rescue the economy during the financial crisis. A lot of people argue that without Bernanke's leadership, we might have had a Great Depression instead of a Great Recession. Janet Yellen, I think, did a very good job during her 4 years. Inflation, again, fluctuated at around 1.5%, 2%. And then Jerome Powell has been the chair ever since. He's been able to keep inflation at around 2%, but you see what's happening at the very end of this chart. During the COVID-19 recession, prices are diving. So it's unclear whether or not we're going to see inflation stay kind of permanently below the 2% target. Will we have deflation? Who knows? The jury, I guess, is still out on whether Jerome Powell is going to be a successful Fed chair. But that's typically how we judge the success or failure in the long run of a chairperson of the Board of Governors. Is how did inflation behave during that person's tenure? Was it nice and stable near the Fed's target, or was it highly volatile and trend up or down too much over time? Okay, any questions about that before we move on? All right, let me now move on, I guess, to the third major component of the Federal Reserve System. So we've covered the district banks. We've covered the Board of Governors. You guys know what their different responsibilities are. Let me talk for a few minutes now about the Federal Open Market Committee. So the FOMC is the 12-member committee that is responsible for the actual conduct of monetary policy in the U.S. Okay? They're the ones whose committee decisions directly influence the availability and the cost of money and credit in our economy. Okay? Now, what is the composition of the FOMC? The FOMC consists of the 7 governors of the BOG, including the chairperson. Okay? I know we only have 5 right now, but in theory we would have 7. And it includes 5 of the other 12 district bank presidents. So that makes up the 12. We've got the 7 governors of the BOG plus 5 of the 12 presidents of the district banks. Those 5 rotate in and out every year on whether or not they get a vote on the actual FOMC. Now, just to be clear, all 12 district bank presidents go to every FOMC meeting, okay? Their views about the economy are shared among the entire committee. And so they have tremendous influence on the decisions that are being made. But it turns out that only 5 of the 12 actually get an official vote in any given year, okay? Now, there's one caveat that you need to know here, and that is that the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is a permanent voting member on the FOMC. That means that the other 11 district bank presidents will rotate those last 4 voting slots on the FOMC on a rotating basis. But because of the special role that the Federal Reserve Bank of New York plays in the operation of monetary policy, the New York Fed president is a permanent voting member. Okay? We'll learn later on in the semester the main way that the Fed conducts monetary policy is through the purchase and sale of assets, of bonds, off of its balance sheet. Okay? The Federal Reserve District Bank that is in charge of those operations, that is the expansion or the shrinking of the Fed's balance sheet, is the New York Fed, because of their proximity to Wall Street. So the district president in New York is a permanent voting member. So that's who makes up the 12 voting members. It's the 7 governors of the BOG, and then 5 of the district bank presidents, with the New York district president being a permanent voting member. If you all care about this, it's not hugely important, but if you follow this link, it will take you to the Federal Reserve's website, and you can see who all the current voting members are and how those voting members will change over the next 2 or 3 years. Actually, they've already got that into the schedule. One minor point I also want to make about this. Historically, the chairperson of the Board of Governors has also been the chairperson of the FOMC. Greenspan was the chair of the FOMC. Bernanke was the chair of the FOMC. So was Yellen, so was Powell. But technically speaking, they don't have to be the same person. The chairperson of the Board of Governors is appointed by the president to serve on these 4-year renewable terms. But in truth, what happens is that for the Federal Open Market Committee, the 12 of them together decide who the chairperson of the FOMC is going to be. It has always been the same as the chair of the Board of Governors, but it doesn't have to be the same person. So for example, if the president nominated or appointed some crazy person to be on the Board of Governors that he wanted to install as the chairperson of the Board of Governors, the FOMC would not necessarily have to make that person the chair of the FOMC. They elect their own, but it's always been the same. Okay, do you guys have any questions then about that? So the last part of class today, I'm going to talk about this issue of central bank independence. I think it's important, kind of the pros and cons of central bank independence, and how central bank independence is kind of correlated with other macroeconomic conditions. But that really, I think it concludes our discussion of the structure and the role of the various components of the Fed. All right. If I have some time at the beginning of the next class, we'll do a couple of review questions at the start of class, just kind of checking your understanding of who does what within the Fed. But I would expect on your first exam some type of question there that asks you to identify the various roles of the district banks versus the Board of Governors versus the FOMC. So make sure you kind of are familiar with the main differences between them. Okay, let me move on then to the last topic in this first section of the course. And that is issues involved with this idea of central bank independence. Central bank independence, I think, is becoming increasingly important as the Fed expands its balance sheet and has more and more influence on the control of our economy. Whether or not the central bank should actually have the independence that it enjoys is a question that is still open. Okay, so first off, Congress created the Federal Reserve to oversee the banking system and to oversee the supply of money in the economy. That was the original intent of the legislation that we talked about in the last class. And I think I also mentioned this, that there actually is not any type of constitutional mandate for the Federal Reserve, okay? The Fed, our nation's central bank, was created by an act of Congress. It can be destroyed by an act of Congress, all right? You guys have certain civil rights, okay? You have the right to free speech, the right to peaceably assemble, okay? You don't have a civil right to access to a nation's central bank. There's no, that's what I mean by there not being a constitutional mandate for a central bank. If enough, if there was a big enough movement in the country to try to eliminate the Fed, then it could be abolished by an act of Congress, as long as the president signs it into law. I say all of this because I want you guys to recognize that because of these facts, the Fed, despite the fact that it does enjoy a great deal of independence, has to operate within a political environment, okay? Here I want to discuss some of the issues surrounding the independence of the Federal Reserve. Now, at the start here, let me just mention, I think it's important to understand why it is or how it is the Fed actually enjoys such independence. And we've already talked about some of these a good bit, okay? One of the institutional reasons why the Federal Reserve is kind of insulated from outside political pressure, why it enjoys this independence, is like I said earlier, these governors appointed to the BOG are appointed to 14-year non-renewable terms in office. And those governors' terms expire once every 2 years. So at least in theory, that means that the executive and legislative branches of our government should not be able to have too much influence over a key component of the Federal Reserve System. The Fed institutionally then has some independence from the rest of the government, much like Supreme Court justices can be independent from Congress and the executive branch. But in my opinion, the number one reason why the Fed enjoys such independence from the rest of the government is not because of reasons 1 and 2 here, but because of reason 3. And that is because the Fed largely has financial independence. Right? Where does the Fed get the money to operate? The Fed has to pay all these salaries to these economists. It's got probably millions of dollars in capital expenses. These Federal Reserve buildings are like castles, okay? It costs a lot of money to run this operation. Where does the Fed get all of that money? It does not come from taxes you pay, at least explicitly. The Fed makes money, right? The Fed purchases and sells a ton of assets off of its balance sheet. The interest and the returns that the Fed makes from the sale of those securities off of its balance sheet, or the holdings of those securities over time, is where the Fed gets its operating money from. Just to put this in perspective, I believe last year the Fed had operating profits of something like $90 billion. $90 billion. That puts the Fed's profits on the same plane as the biggest corporations in the world, the biggest oil companies, the biggest tech giants, all of them. Okay, I think Apple had like $50 billion in profits. And somebody can probably Google that. But the Fed generates billions of dollars in revenue from the purchase and sale of the assets from its portfolio. Yeah, and that's where it gets its operating expenses. Just one second. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is other government organizations like the Department of Education or the Department of Health or the Department of Defense or the FBI or the CIA, where do they get their operating budgets from? Congressional appropriations. They have to go up with hat in hand to Congress every year and beg for money. So Congress can heavily scrutinize what they're doing because they control the purse. Congress does not really control the purse when it comes to the Fed. And that gives the Fed a great deal of independence in its activities. Yes? Sorry? Well, technically, yes. The Fed's tax rate on its profits is 100%. And by that, I mean what? Any end-of-year profits that the Fed makes, guess where they go? Right back to the United States Treasury Department. The Treasury Department has a checking account with the Fed. The Fed is the U.S. Treasury's bank. So any profits the Fed makes after it's paid all of its bills gets remitted right back to the Treasury, either to shrink debt or to allow the Treasury to purchase other goods. So in that sense, there is a tax rate on it. Okay. So those are the institutional reasons why the Fed enjoys independence. The most important, I think, is this financial independence. Let me talk just briefly here about some of the common pros versus cons of central banks having a great deal of independence. And then I've got time, I'm going to show you some actual data on the relationship between central bank independence and overall macroeconomic performance. A couple of the common arguments in favor of Fed independence is, number one, that monetary policy is really technical, all right? You have to have a PhD in economics to understand how to conduct monetary policy and how it affects the rest of the world, right? It affects really important things like inflation, interest rates, economic growth. All of that stuff affects our material well-being. And because monetary policy is so complicated, It's too important to be allowed to be determined by members of Congress who know nothing about monetary policy, right? We want to appoint technocrats at our central bank to conduct monetary policy because only they're smart enough to do the job, right? That's one of the arguments in favor of central bank independence, is that they have the technical knowledge that members of Congress or even the president don't have in conducting monetary policy. Right? A lot of times you can think that members of Congress or even the president, they have to get reelected, right? So they may not have the best interests of the economy in the long run in their hearts. Whereas central bankers that are appointed to these longer terms that have independence from the rest of the government might be better equipped at achieving those goals. That's kind of the argument there. Another argument that's related to that is this idea that if the Fed has independence or if any central bank has independence, it's going to be less susceptible to these things called political business cycles. You guys ever heard that concept before? So you obviously know what a regular business cycle is. We're in the midst of a recession caused by COVID-19. But there's a theory in political science or in political economy of this thing called a political business cycle, whereby if we delegate control of monetary policy to elected officials, what might happen? In the months leading up to the re-elections of incumbents, those elected officials might do something to monetary policy to try to stimulate the economy in order to curry favor with the electorate and increase the chances that they're going to be reelected, right? In other words, we would have what's called a political business cycle, where the economy goes down, but then returns in an expansion in these election cycles, right? Most people think that that's probably suboptimal for an economy, and so to eliminate these political business cycles, you want to give a central bank greater independence. What about arguments against central bank independence? Well, the main one, in my view, is in a true democracy, monetary policy decisions should not be entrusted to unelected officials that cannot be held accountable by the voting public. Right? So monetary policy is a really technical subject. That's the argument in favor of delegating it to these technocrats, right? But yet, isn't foreign policy technical and complicated? Isn't national security also a complicated field or endeavor? But yet, the people who are in charge of national security and foreign policy are elected officials. They're members of Congress. They're the president or the president's cabinet, right? And so in the interest of greater democracy, one might be against Fed independence because we're giving control of the monetary policy levers to people who are essentially unaccountable to the voting public. That's actually one of the major arguments against Federal Reserve independence. Another compelling one, in my opinion, is that, and one that is even more relevant in today's environment, is that if we were to give Congress, for instance, more control over central bank actions, then Congress could better coordinate the efforts of fiscal policy and monetary policy. Sometimes in the past, fiscal policy may have tried to stimulate the economy, but then monetary policy turns right around and tries to put on the policy brakes, right? So monetary and fiscal policy are running at cross purposes with one another. If we gave more control of the Fed to Congress or to elected officials, presumably they could do a better job trying to coordinate fiscal and monetary policy, thereby creating more efficient policy solutions. I'm not saying I'm in favor of doing that. I'm just saying that's one common argument against Fed independence. You guys have any questions about that? Let me show you also, in closing here, let me just show you one more picture. And that is some evidence on the relationship between central bank independence and macroeconomic performance. So over the past few decades, there's been lots of research that has gone into trying to determine how independent different central banks across the world are. And some economists, some teams have actually developed these things called central bank independence indices, or a CBI index, okay? And given a bunch of features within each of these specific countries, you can basically create an index that shows how independent that central bank is. Numbers that are closer to 1 indicate a central bank that enjoys a greater degree of independence. Numbers that are closer to 0 is a central bank that is not very independent from the Treasury Department or the executive branch, okay? What's the first thing I want to show you guys? The left graph here shows a cross-section of different countries, and each of these dots shows a combination of the central bank independence for that country in the 1980s versus the most recent decade. What do we see happening over time? What's the general trend? Central banks today are more independent than they were in 1980. Right, so the general trend globally has been to move towards more central bank independence, not away from it. The right graph here shows the average central bank independence between 1980 and 2012 for these same countries, graphed against each of those countries' average inflation rates. This is the graph I really want you to pay more attention to. What does it show you here? What is the correlation? Or is there any association between a country's average inflation rate in the long run and the amount of independence that that central bank enjoys? What do you see in that picture? James?
More independent, lower.
That's right. Countries like Switzerland, Germany, France, United States, Canada, these are countries that exhibit some of the highest degrees of central bank independence. There are also countries that have enjoyed the lowest average annual inflation rates. Countries that have had less central bank independence over time, Japan, New Zealand, have had somewhat higher annual inflation rates. Now, let me just word of caution, this graph is a bit dated. It only looks at data up through 2012. But these kinds of studies are done continuously. And typically what the data shows is that the more independent a central bank is, the better that central bank will perform along its major policy priority. And that is trying to maintain kind of low and stable inflation. That's the key empirical fact we see regarding central bank independence. Yes, there are some arguments against it, but it's done a really good job at keeping inflation low and stable in a lot of countries, not just in the United States, across the globe. Okay, do you guys have any questions about that? All that makes sense? So we will begin the next topic on Wednesday, which is the money supply process. I will take probably, I think, 3 full classes to get through all of that material. The first class along that topic is definitely the most important. That's where we're going to introduce one of the most important concepts in modern central banking, and that is the Fed's balance sheet. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about what that is exactly, what's on the asset side of the Fed's balance sheet versus the liabilities, and how when the Fed makes decisions about the size of its balance sheet, that affects monetary policy, and how that filters through the entire money supply process. Really, really important concept to understand how the Fed operates procedurally the rest of the semester. So the next class is a really important one, all right? I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Thank you.